Hey there, friends. Welcome back to As a Man Thinketh on NASA TV. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about Idaho, because as you guys remember, last summer we experienced this water curtailment in Idaho that threatened to shut down hundreds of acres of farmland across the state of Idaho.
On May 31st, Idaho Department of Water Resources Director Matthew Weaver issued a curtailment order for 6 groundwater districts. Is that a big deal?
It's estimated that about 500,000 acres are subject to curtailment, which is half of all the groundwater acres in the eastern Snake River Plain. So for many reasons, that's a very big deal.
The state of Idaho has put a water curtailment order, which is basically a water shutoff order, on literally 500,000 acres of farmland. That's a lot of potatoes. A lot of these farmers, this impacts about 6,400 water users, but a lot of these farmers that are farming this land have already invested thousands of acres, thousands of dollars per acre to grow potatoes.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Trevor Belknap. I operate a family farm, a 5th-generation family farm in the Snake River Valley of eastern Idaho. And I just wanted to visit with you for a minute about the impacts of the water curtailment order that's been issued by Director Weaver from the Idaho Department of Water Resources. The situation in which we find ourselves is about as bad as it gets. Not only will we be out of business, many other businesses will be highly impacted, and you, as my friends and neighbors, will also be impacted because we're so interconnected. If the ag economy in eastern Idaho fails, which it surely will if this curtailment order is in place, it can remain in place, will dry up and blow away, just like it did back in the Dust Bowl of the 30s. Banks will fail, equipment dealers, car dealers, gas stations, grocery stores, all rely on the ag economy that's here in eastern Idaho. The children in our schools, how many of them belong to families who work in some form of ag industry in eastern Idaho? It's horrible, and we need to fix it. And I would propose to you that it is not a water problem, it's a management problem, because we have water. Reservoirs are full, the mountains are covered in snow, the river's been flowing well. So why now? Why, after we've planted our crops, we have crops in the ground that are already growing, now in the middle of June, they pull a curtailment order to say, you must cease pumping water. The cost is huge. An acre of potatoes costs upward of $4,000 an acre to grow. How will that ever be recovered? They will not grow without water. And what will that do to everyone else that's reliant upon us in this area and the state of Idaho? What will the counties do for roads and bridges, police departments, ambulances, hospitals that rely on the tax base? Property like this will become worthless. Without water, the land doesn't have any value here. What will they do? We need to consider these things, and we need to talk to our elected officials. We need to call them now and push on them to find a workable solution, a compromise that will allow businesses like ours to continue to progress and grow and succeed in the Snake River Valley, and allow those in the southern part of the state to also continue to go. We need to work together to find a common solution, or we're all going to fail.
Now, they finally reached an agreement in the fall of this year, which should hopefully help prevent future water curtailments, but only time will tell, right? I mean, these people always find a way around something. But one of the unique things about Idaho that many of you caught on to, and I think, we discussed a little bit on this channel, was, why they did the curtailment in the first place. And a lot of us traced it back to the cobalt mines, and the green energy consumption of data centers, as well as, the supplying these cobalt mines with green energy. So somebody had sent me some information on the cobalt mines in Idaho, and asking if, the reason why they were trying to curtail the water was to bankrupt the Idaho farmers. The timing of the curtailment is questionable. right? Because they waited until after the farmers had invested $400 an acre in fertilizer and, who only knows how much in seed potatoes and seeds. I mean, some of these estimates that I've heard have been upwards of over $1,000 an acre invested by these farmers into farming land and providing us with food. So the question then becomes, are they purposefully trying to put them out of business to steal their land? I did look into the cobalt strip in Idaho, and for those of you who don't know, cobalt is mined for clean energy, and it's usually, most of the time, the cobalt is mined out of the Congo and Africa. And this is a horrible process. I mean, for those of you who are dedicated to your electric cars, think about it this way. The cobalt mines in Africa, they are one of the most modern day sources of enslavement in the world. They are extremely dirty mines. They cause an extraordinary amount of pollution. They have here in the United States as well, right there in Idaho. So when you think about clean energy and what it actually looks like, this is what it looks like they're doing to our national forests to extract this element that they need to create clean energy, expand our electrical grids, build more electric cars. But the cobalt mine in Idaho is a little different than what you're seeing in Congo, because as you know, most of these things have to be mined and taken to China to be turned into products that we buy as consumers. The cobalt in Idaho, though, is a different ball game altogether, and I'm going to get into that. But looking at the cobalt field in Idaho, it does stretch into some of the farmlands in question. So it does raise some eyebrows, saying, is there cobalt underneath those farms? How much money is that worth? What are they willing to do for it? But I also, I'm not sure how far it stretches underneath the farms. I don't think it's a large amount of farms. And they haven't even gotten that far with mining yet. I feel like this is a future problem that they may run into. And, this is what we know about cobalt in Idaho is just what's been discovered. That doesn't mean that there's not more to that field that has not been discovered. They're mining again on property owned by the U.S. government, our national forests. That's where these mines actually happen. The bigger question I think that comes into this is, the water usage that it takes to mine cobalt. And that's what this entire water curtailment was about. And if you wanted to come up with a long-term solution, putting the farmers out of business would be that long-term solution. The farmers, though, in this case, they're not just up against the cobalt mines. And I think the cobalt mines are rather interesting, because when we get into this, you'll see that money that we pass to go to aid in Ukraine is actually going to this Australian cobalt mine in Idaho. And the reason for that is the U.S. Department of Defense is preparing for World War III. I mean, there's no ifs, ands, and buts about it. We need that cobalt for our weapons, for our national security. It's not going into electric vehicles like a lot of people say, or these other things. It is actually going into our defense. We can't rely on China if we end up in war with China to supply us with cobalt for our weapons. So I think that there's a big issue there as far as, it's one of the only cobalt mines in the United States. It is one of the largest cobalt strips in the United States. There's also cobalt in Montana, not far above, the Idaho cobalt area. But it does bring into question, do we have to have this cobalt for our national defense? And if so, what does happen to farmers out there? Personally, I'm not in favor of World War III, so I'd rather we not mine the cobalt and we keep the farmers. But I'm just throwing this information out there so you can see what exactly these farmers are up against. They're not up against saving generations of farmland, providing food for the masses. I mean, heck, if you make food more scarce, it's easier to control the masses, right? And if we end up in a situation where we are in World War III and we're heading toward in that direction faster than we ever have, then you want that control over the public, and you want that resource for our weapons. But many of us know that the Biden administration was pushing to reopen this cobalt mine. And they weren't just looking at reopening it, but I believe that they were looking at expanding it. If you watch this channel, I did a video talking about low-flying helicopters that were doing geological studies of the cobalt belt, which runs through Idaho and a tiny bit into Montana. But what they were looking for was the true expanse of the resources that they had available to them. Whether or not there were farms on the land doesn't matter. They'll make it available if they need to make it available. If you are a farmer in Idaho, you might be noticing some low-flying helicopters with some cylindrical tubes on the front of them. These helicopters are nothing to worry about. They're just shooting radar deep down into the earth. It probably has no impact on you. If it does, just think of it as a free radiology treatment. And they are studying, they're doing a geological survey of your farmland and the surrounding areas, all the way up into Montana. I'm going to put a map up here so you guys can see where this geological survey is taking place. A lot of this is taking place in areas that you're probably familiar with the recent water curtailment. So Bingham County, Blaine, Bonneville, Butte, Clark, Custer, Jefferson, and Lemhi in Idaho. And then in Montana, there's Beaverhead, Deer Lodge, Madison, Silver Bow. All of these areas are along the Idaho-Montana cobalt belt. And basically, the purpose of the survey is to provide images that expand the fundamental knowledge of geology underpinning the Great Falls Teutonic Zone in the Montana-Idaho cobalt belt. The area of interest covers numerous focus areas that are prospective for critical mineral resources and is designed to assist with the mapping of subsurface faults for earthquake hazard studies. They'll also be looking into the water flows out of the aquifer so they can better understand the aquifer with this study. So this is a pretty big study. It's going to take several months. They have 2 helicopters that will be flying out. They'll be flying pretty low. Really, the only one who benefited from shutting down these farms, the only surface water user who was truly benefiting from this was the power company themselves. Frank Vandersloot had a good explanation on this, so I'm just going to play that for you real quick.
In the first place, the Department of Water Resources called for shutting down 695,000 acres. The order didn't say that. The order called for 1.6 million acre feet. 1.6 million acre feet. Now, why did they do that? Because they needed 42,000 acre feet in Twin Falls. You say, whoa. Just a second. They needed, 72,000. They needed 72,000 acre feet of water in Twin Falls? And you're going to close down 1.6 million acre feet up here? How does that make any sense? Well, I'll tell you why it makes sense. And translated, acre feet is amounts of water, big amounts. Let's turn it into acres. They needed water to irrigate 12,000 acres in Twin Falls, and they demanded to shut down 695,000 acres up here. That's not a good trade, I think. I don't think you have to be a mathematician or very bright to know that's not a good trade. Why is that? Why do we have to shut off that much up here? It's because the aquifer is not efficient in how it distributes water. They don't know. They have these fancy formulas. Nobody knows. It's kind of like global warming. Nobody knows if it's right. There's calculations, and that's their best guess. There's a lot of science that goes into it. I don't claim to be an expert, but they said that's what you need to do. They need 72,000 down here. This was a forecast that was done. The order came out on May 30th, and so that's what happened. Now, why? Because the aquifer is not efficient. The aquifer is, they tell me, has as much water as Lake Erie in it. We can't see where it goes. It goes different places, and it goes everywhere. So if we put water in here, or don't use it, we put water in, it flows downstream in the aquifer, and eventually makes its way back into the Snake River. So you have these basalt barriers that come in, then it funnels the water into, it all goes downstream. It all goes back into the Snake River eventually. If you leave it in the aquifer is like a big leaky bathtub, they tell me, like a bathtub full of bullet holes. and you can fill it up, it's going to leak back down. You can just keep water in, and you can get it to come up, but then it'll go back down. And where does it go? Into the Snake River. And you say, okay, so just a second. We're going to close down 1.6 million acre feet to give them 72,000. What happened to the other 1.5 million acre feet? Where does that go? Well, it goes all over the place, except eventually it goes back into the Snake River, down to Idaho Power, and then to Oregon, and then to Washington.
Makes perfect sense, right? So they shut these farmers off, and the thing about this is they did it after crops were already in the ground, okay? So on June 11th, when the Water Resources Department goes out and starts red tagging wells for compliance, saying, hey, look, this well needs to be shut off, you turn it on, you could face criminal charges, and they started doing this across Idaho. Well, those farmers could not turn their wells on to water their crops, and so you actually did have crop damage, because even though this only went on for about a week before it was reversed, that week caused crop damage. Crops weren't getting the water that they need, the resources that they need. Farmers lost money just in a week. It'd be like us going through, a week of drought or a week or two of drought. It could have some impacts depending on, what stage your crop's growth were in. We don't know the full extent of those impacts. They could have been minor for all I know, but there were impacts. What happened with the water curtailment stems back to an agreement from 2015. And in that agreement, a group of groundwater users and a group of surface water users, which are basically junior and senior water rights holders, got together to come up with an agreement to keep a water curtailment from impacting junior water rights users. This agreement was supposed to offer groundwater users a structure that would safeguard them against future water curtailments. However, any safe harboring or safeguarding was only in the preamble of the agreement. The whereas parts wasn't actually in the body of the agreement. And nobody really knows what happened back when this took place. There were very few farmers even knew that this agreement was being drawn up, and so it didn't have a whole lot of input from a lot of the farmers that were impacted. But bottom line, there were a lot of oversights in that agreement, oversights that ended up costing the farmers dearly. I mean, they basically signed their death sentence as well as all the other groundwater users in the district. I'm not putting blame on them. It's more of an attorney thing than it is the farmers trying to negotiate the contract. So they're trying to negotiate the points. It was up to the attorneys to make sure the points were in the contracts. So this agreement goes into effect for about 6 years, right? And then in 2021, all of a sudden, the Idaho Department of Water Resources says, you know what, we don't want to count averaging anymore. And what's averaging? Well, under the agreement, you have good water years, and then you have bad water years, and you have, average water years. So they base their water usage off of average water years. And on the good water years, that good water stayed into the aquifer, built it up like money in a savings bank, right? On the bad water years, they spent excess water. So they took water out of their savings account, the aquifer, and were able to water their crops and keep themselves going. So the overall agreement was you have a baseline, and we're going to base your water usage off of that baseline. It makes perfect sense. It allows for planning, right? You can plan that you're going to be able to plant crops this year and how much water you're going to be able to use because you're going off of an average baseline. Like I said, in 2021, they nixed the whole averaging concept. Back when they nixed the averaging concept, they actually went to court over it. The groundwater users were like, hey, you can't do that. We had an agreement. This could end up messing with us, right? So they go to court, the Supreme Court looks at it and says, well, what does your state law say about this? If your state law doesn't have anything to say about this, then, the agency has the right to legislate. And so they went back to the state legislators. The state legislators did nothing. And if you read about this issue currently right now, the same thing is happening again. The state legislators are doing nothing. Governor Little has basically said this has to be an agreement between the farmers. I don't necessarily disagree with him on it, but the problem with this is that you have one group of farmers that have complete control over the conversation because of the state law, regardless of what the junior rights holders want or try and negotiate for. They kind of have a gun to their head that says, hey, you're going to end up signing our deal at the end of the day because If you don't, we're just going to shut your water off. The law allows us to do that. We already did it to you earlier this year. You saw what can happen. So it's not a very fair conversation. And I do blame that a little bit on the state kind of not wanting to get involved with legislature around this particular concept. But anyway, this thing went back to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court obviously ruled in the favor of the Idaho Department of Water Resources because there's no state law that says anything else. In 2023, the Idaho Department of Water Resources came out again and changed the law, the rules and how they calculate shortages in water. So they changed their calculation methods. And this, I'm going to get a little bit into the timeline of when that happened in a few minutes because it's very curious. But when they changed that rule, that's what created this massive shortage where they had to shut down 1 million acre feet of water to make up for 72,000 acre feet. So that's kind of the brief background history, for dummies on this particular subject. You have these certain rule changes that occurred over time. The agreement is pretty much outdated, null and void. Farmers have a gun to their heads to negotiate with other farmers. But it's not just other farmers that they're negotiating with. And that's where this whole thing gets tricky.
What happened to the other 1.5 million acre feet? Where does that go? Well, it goes all over the place, except eventually it goes back into the Snake River, down to Idaho Power.
Frank Vandersloot, in one of his interviews, brought up an interesting point to me. And that was that on April 19th, that's when the Idaho Department of Water Resources made a press release on their website kind of announcing that this was a problem and that these farmers could face curtailment. At that time, Idaho Power stock reversed rather dramatically. It had been falling and it dramatically reversed.
Is the stock price from IDACorp, that's the parent company of Idaho Power. On April 18th, by the way, the stock had been going down until April 18th, the governor's office announces that they're turning off the water to this area, the groundwater. Then the stock price of Idaho Power jumps, and it jumps again the next day and the next day and continues to go up for the next 30 days. Okay, this was the turnaround day. That was the low. Everything turned around. Why does that happen? Why does, when the governor says, I'm going to turn off the farmer's water, does the stock price of Idaho Power jump?
A lot of people could look at this and say, okay, well, based on his description of where the water goes, increased water flow on the river obviously creates more energy, and therefore Idaho Power benefits the most. Nobody's pointing fingers at Idaho Power, and I think it's important to remember that Idaho Power could simply just be an investment strategy here. But the point is they made their stock price made a tremendous reversal on the release of this news. Another key correlating date is when they went out around June 11th to actually start shutting off wells. You started seeing a high volume of shares trade of Idaho Power.
Then there's this question. This is a graph of the amount of shares traded, okay? Now, it normally runs about 300,000 on average, 300,000 shares traded of IDACorp per day. Until June 11th, which is the date the governor actually they send these people out to actually shut down the wells. They start red tagging wells and turning off wells. On that day, the volume, the number of shares traded that day of Idaho Power go from 300,000 to over 1.3 million shares in that day.
So my question is, regardless of how much power you create, if you bankrupt half your constituency, if you bankrupt half of Idaho, then, what good does that do you? Nobody's there to buy the power off of you. But if you look at these timelines, there are other things that have been going on, and you can follow these other events even further back in the overall discussion of water curtailment in the state of Idaho. The thing that I think you will find going forward is that this isn't the end of cobalt mining in Idaho. They will reopen that cobalt mine. The United States needs the cobalt, and there's actually a bipartisan legislation trying to pass right now that basically says that if the Pentagon has an interest in the mine, they can skip a lot of the federal permitting processes. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there in the future. I don't think that Trump is necessarily going to stop the cobalt mines, although I do think that things will go a lot differently, probably a lot smoother with the people of Idaho. And I'll get into that in just a minute and explain to you what I think the key differences there would be. I find it interesting, Idaho is rich in mineral resources. And the cobalt is one piece of this, but when it comes to rare earth metals, Idaho is another top place to get those rare earth metals. A couple weeks ago, we heard that China has banned the export of a lot of the rare earth metals that we need to the United States. China is one of the world's largest suppliers of rare earth metals, and we get a lot of it from China, but they've put a ban coming to the United States. We've put ourselves in this weird dependency on somebody who we consider an adversary, and when we do something that they don't like, they just cut us off, right? And I think that as time progresses, that relationship is only going to deteriorate further. I think that we have to look at other ways than trading with China for these rare earth metals. And that's why I think that you won't see an end to these mines going into the next administration, but I do think that you'll see a different approach. The Stibnite gold mine, which is in Valley County, Idaho, is actually one of the United States' richest rare earth mineral mines in the country. They've been trying to reopen it for years, and actually that's one of the reasons why they want to pass this legislation, to make it easier for permitting at the federal level in the event that the mine produces resources that the Pentagon would need for our national security, or whatever it is that they feel they need it for. So this mine is going to most likely reopen. If I had to guess, the way that Trump gets things done is it would reopen within the next 4 years. And so this is another mine that will take away resources and have some sort of impact on farmers. Now, the difference, I think, between the previous administration, or the current administration, and the new administration coming in, is that the current administration, number one, they were requiring that a lot of these mines operate off of clean, green energy, and that required taking a lot of resources away from the farmers of Idaho. And that's why we had a water curtailment, in my opinion. I mean, everybody has a different opinion on it, but in my opinion, that was a big issue that faced the farmers, was that they had to power this mine off of clean energy, so they were increasing the water flow in the rivers, which increases the power production of the dam, which would allow them to power this big cobalt mine. And now we have this other mine that will also most likely be opening. Anytime that you have mines, they do take away resources, they take away water, and they reallocate. They don't take it away, but they would have to reallocate certain resources that farmers also depend on. So I definitely think that there would be some sort of impact on farms in Idaho from either one of these mines reopening. But I don't think that it's going to be one of those secretive things where they try and, shice people out of their land. I think it would be a lot more open. I think that the new administration coming in is a little more blunt with their intentions. They don't have a problem telling you, hey, we need to do this. But I also think that they're going to not require these mines to operate off of green energy. They'll allow fossil fuel usage. They'll allow a lot of other. They'll do things, in other words, that will mitigate the amount of resources that will come directly from Idaho and therefore impact those farms. Personally, I don't like the idea of these mines opening. I'm a lot like the rest of you with that. But I also recognize the dependency that we have on a country that doesn't really like us that much. And I do understand that it's going to impact our national security if we don't do something about it. I think that if we didn't have all these electric cars and technologies that invade our lives every single day, we probably wouldn't need as many rare earth minerals as we have put ourselves in the position of needing. But I can't do anything about that. And I can't do anything about them opening the mines. But what I can do is ask that those resources that go into those mines are spread out more evenly in a fair way that doesn't impact as many farmers as several 100,000 acres. I think it was 500,000 or 600,000 acres of farms that they were trying to shut down with those curtailments. So I think that there's some tough choices that are ahead for the new administration, particularly when it comes to this matter, because they're not going to want to come in and try and secretly take land from people, and they're less likely to use eminent domain unless it's absolutely necessary, or use force like water curtailments unless it's absolutely necessary. They're more of the type who's going to come in, tell you exactly what they're doing, and then try and figure out the best way to mitigate it so it has the least amount of impact on everybody. But I do think that there will be impacts. Another way of mitigating this, and somebody had asked me about this, and I think it is fairly valid. But somebody had asked, does Trump really want to buy Greenland? And does Trump really want to make Canada the 51st state? I think the Canada 51st state was more of a joke than anything else. If you've met a lot of the people in Canada, most of the country is kind of similar to the United States. They think the same way that a lot of us think, but then you have certain areas that are just overrun and they control the vote. So I think that was a joke. But when you look at Greenland, it's not so much about military base positioning or anything like that. Greenland is rich in rare earth minerals. And so if you were able to purchase such a resource, then you could have less of an impact here at home. Doesn't mean that that is not impacting Greenland or one of those areas. But my theory is that the big draw towards Greenland has more to do with his mineral resources than anything else. And I think that what we'll see is an attempt to create an economic union with Canada. Right now, you're hearing a lot in the news about trade wars and tariffs, but a lot of that is a push, in my opinion, a push to negotiate. And I think that what we'll see is an economic union with Canada. And again, what does Canada have in abundance that we don't have in abundance? That is rare earth minerals. So there are other ways of gaining these resources, striking trade deals with countries that have these resources that aren't our adversaries, and trying to, at least kind of spread out where we're getting the resources from. But in many ways, it would still leave us dependent. I don't know what an economic union would do as far as tying two countries together, but it could create some sort of agreement that would protect those mineral resources for our use in the future. Like I said, these are just things that I think could be happening because of stories that we've read, what their intentions might actually be, and seeing that China has put a ban on these minerals, and seeing that they are necessary for a lot of our technology today, a lot of our lifestyle today, a lot of our economic functioning today. There's going to be a push to try and figure out where to get them from. And unfortunately, Idaho, I think, is still at the center, at the hot spot of this because of its rich mineral resources. And there's way too much money in this for them to just say, oh, we're not going to move forward with these mines. In fact, I see a lot of incentive for a lot of our lawmakers to move forward with laws that would expedite the processes. So I'm curious to see how all of this unfolds as we go into the new year with the new administration. I'm hoping that they're at least open and honest about what they're doing instead of being shysty, because that, I think, plays a lot into this stuff. If people are aware of intentions and understand what the needs are, there's always ways of mitigating and figuring out the best way to go about it so it has the least amount of impact. But what happened before, I think, was a very shysty situation. Like I said, we can only time will tell. Under the new administration is how they choose to go about this, how they choose to handle it. I just throwing it out there that this is still a real issue, and it's intensifying. It's intensifying because we've been cut off. Anyway, guys, it's been a great holiday season. It's always tough to get back in front of the camera and start sharing stories with you. January is a tough time for us as well, but we will keep reporting on these things and keeping you up to date on what's going on out there.